So these books, they were never written for UPSC. And that's great because they have very good content, they have excellent analysis, and you can always borrow if you want to. So when I speak as a result of having read these and several other books. There are people who also refer to Ram Ahuja's Society in India. If I can draw a parallel, it's the Chetan Bhagat of sociology. So these are the books that you can always refer to. Indian Society by S.C. Dubey, the NCERT Class 12 textbooks, excellent books. You must read them whenever you get time. Okay, sources done. और कुछ आपके जहन में इसके अलावा? Okay, that's more than enough then. Now let's come back to, did anyone miss out on anything I said? All right, let's come to caste. So let's start with some very important pointers that question the commonsensical understanding of caste. Right? Let's defamiliarize ourselves, and only then we can familiarize ourselves. Very often people think caste is a Hindu social institution. That's not the case. Muslims of the world are quite convinced that caste is something that's to do with the other. Right? It's not there in our community. Utter nonsense. Right? Muslims are as casteist, no offense, as casteist as Hindus, right? Kind of peers when it comes to casteism or casteist practices. I won't go into the details right away, but the simple argument is, let us not start on this note that caste is a Hindu phenomenon or it's a Hindu social institution. Caste is essentially an Indian social institution, which is to say that various communities that came to India embraced caste in one form or another. Now, Muslims were not casteist. Of course, Muslims, please. Muslims had other parameters of hierarchy. So if you read Ibn Khaldun, he has written extensively on Asabiyat in his social history. So Muslims had other parameters. So there was tribalism, there was other kinds of clan-based hierarchies. But when they enter into the subcontinent in the 8th century, and I'm talking about the entry in the north, I'm not talking about the Malabar entry. That's a completely different narrative, the Arabs entering through trade routes. I'm talking about the north. When they enter into the subcontinent, they also begin to sort of assimilate, right? So within 3 to 4 centuries, Muslims also embrace a certain idea of hierarchy that is to do with birth, right? So we need to start on this, that caste is not something that is only to be associated with the Hindu social order. Now, one thing that can, of course, be said is that the origin of caste is to be traced back to the Hindu scriptures, right? I don't think that can be contested because caste, if we are thinking about how old is caste in different religious communities, of course, the Hindu social order will take the prize, right? But to think that other communities are devoid of caste is to be, is to fool ourselves, the long and short of it. So the Muslims also follow caste in different ways. The Christians also follow caste. And the irony is that the Buddhists also follow caste. Imagine Ambedkar actually embraced Buddhism to do away with the caste, with the curse of the Varnashram system. But what it has come down to is that there are excellent ethnographies that tell us about caste practices among Buddhists of different regions of Ladakh. Particularly, I'm aware of an ethnography in Ladakh, but we are told that there is a certain, among Sikhs as well. So we are essentially looking at caste as a pan-Indian phenomenon that is across religious communities. So we start on that it is not it's not a Hindu phenomenon, but an Indian phenomenon, which is to again say that various communities at various points in time gradually assimilated the tenets of caste system. Clear? Okay. If you look at the history, so we really don't know because, of course, there's a lot of mythological reference. But if you look at the literary history, in the sense that when exactly did people start writing about caste? So we go back to the times of Chandragupta Maurya, and it is here that a Greek envoy, Megasthenes, writes about caste. One thing that we get to know about these ancient accounts all the way till Al-Biruni, medieval, there are 2-3 things that they all refer to. One is endogamy. The other is some idea of hierarchy. and then a connection between occupation and caste. So these are the three features that you find in writings across 16 centuries approximately, right? So till as late as medieval India and all the way from 4th, 3rd century BC, you will find people, of course, not everyone is writing, but whoever is writing about caste is essentially looking at these three features as core features. So they are talking about endogamy. Endogamy is marrying within the group, and we will discuss this in more detail in a bit. And they are talking about some sort of connection between occupation and caste. So the caste you are born into also assigns a certain occupation that you will have, right? So that's the second, and some idea of hierarchy, which is informed by purity pollution logic. That if you're up the hierarchy, you are pure, you're down the hierarchy, you are impure or you are polluted, right? The important thing is that the reference to untouchables is not to be found in the early accounts. So the reference to untouchability is usually to be found in Al-Biruni's account, wherein the word that he uses, and some of us who are from UP might immediately get it, and they will also get how casteist our language is, malich. So our grandparents very often use this when you don't bathe for a day or two. They malich ki tarah ghum rahe ho. So it's a very casteist reference, and they can very well be booked by the courts of law, right? And you might be tempted to do that. But anyways, so it's Al-Biruni who uses this particular term, but Al-Biruni is not in favor of this idea of pollution. He does not believe in it because he thinks this is a completely superstitious idea. Anything that is polluted can always become clean again. And he has all kinds of interesting arguments to give, but I won't go into that. So this is more of history, but let's come to more recent accounts. This is just a background, right? That whenever people wrote about caste, they were thinking about occupation, they were thinking about marriage, marrying within the group, and they were thinking about hierarchy, which is informed by a certain logic of purity pollution. Now, moving further, if you look at just the word, of course, this is not a word that is familiar to us in the sense that this does not come from our languages. This has a certain Portuguese origin, and the word essentially comes from the Spanish word casta, C-A-S-T-A, and casta essentially means breed, even in some contexts, race, right? So casta, and then this Spanish word, C-A-S-T-A, is to be traced back to a Latin word, which is castus, C-A-S-T-U-S, which essentially has to do with pure or unmixed. Pure is always something that is unadulterated, right? So that's the origin of the word. Breed or race. Breed समझ रहे हैं ना आप लोग? और उसको अगर और उसके पीछे origins पे जाएंगे तो जो उसका Latin castus, C-A-S-T-U-S, just to get an idea. So maybe when these Latin American, European navigators, right, 15th, 16th century, when they were looking at these groups, so this is the word that essentially struck them. So they were thinking about these as different groups that were living on the logic of some idea of purity, right? Okay, now if you want to write a definition, so there are, so one is just a quick definition, so you can just write, caste is a hereditary, endogamous, usually localized group. Caste is a hereditary, endogamous, usually localized group having traditional association with an occupation. Having traditional association with an occupation. Having traditional association with an occupation and a particular position in the local hierarchy. आप लोगों की स्पीड गड़बड़ है भाई, तेज करिए स्पीड, ऐसे तो हम लोग एक साल तक सोशल इश्यूज ही करते रहेंगे. This in itself is an issue. Caste is a hereditary, endogamous, usually localized group having traditional association with an occupation and a particular position in the local hierarchy of castes. So, in this definition, you get to sense a range of features of caste system. It's hereditary, meaning that you are assigned a caste right at your birth. So your parents, your father's caste particularly, is your caste. So it's hereditary in that sense. Endogamous, I have already shared with you that they marry within the group. Localized, meaning caste is not a pan-Indian phenomenon. It manifests itself locally. कहने का मतलब ये, if you go from one region to another, the local versions of caste change. I'll discuss this in more detail. And traditional association with an occupation, ये आप लोगों को पता है. And a position in the local hierarchy. You cannot have a caste group that does not have a position in the hierarchy. If there is a hierarchy, you have to be in the hierarchy. या तो फिर hierarchy हो ही नहीं. But अगर किसी भी setup में, if there is any social system that has a certain hierarchy, then there is no group that is outside hierarchy. All groups are hierarchically arranged. So any caste group also has a certain position in the local hierarchy. Okay. It's also a closed system of stratification. अभी के लिए हम इसको closed system कह रहे हैं, आगे जाके we will contest it. Closed system का मतलब ये है that in this system, the possibility of mobility, the possibility of groups going up or down is not there. That's a closed system. Or the possibility, shall we say, the possibility is negligible. I think that's better. The possibility of mobility. Mobility कभी भी सिर्फ एक तरफ के लिए नहीं होती है, right? Mobility is upward as well as downward. तो हम आम तौर पे सोचते हैं mobility का मतलब सिर्फ यही होता है कि PN का लड़का IAS बन गया. That's upward mobility, and that's also intergenerational mobility. But mobility could also be downward, right? That somebody who was a manager and his son ends up becoming someone who's less than a manager. So that's downward mobility and so on. So caste system के बारे में कहते हैं, it's a closed system of stratification. It's a system of stratification that does not offer much in terms of groups moving up and down. But we will question this. कुछ फीचर्स जो कास्ट के हैं, जनरली स्पीकिंग, determined by birth, we are already aware of this. You are born and therefore you remain as member of a caste, particular caste group throughout your life. There are strict rules pertaining to marriage. Remember, endogamy is considered as the most important feature of caste. Ambedkar said this is the fortress. If you were to do something about endogamy, you will do something about caste. So Ambedkar was absolutely clear that if people could do something about endogamy as a practice, they will indirectly end up annihilating caste, right? So strict marriage rules, rules about food and food sharing, very elaborate rules. We'll come to that. खाना क्या खाना है, किससे ले सकते हैं, किससे नहीं ले सकते, किसको दे सकते हैं, किसको नहीं दे सकते, and then the list is quite long. पानी, खाना, कच्चा खाना, etc., etc. We'll come to that. Hierarchy of rank and status, you know this, linkage with occupation. And there's one more thing, subdivision. Subdivision का मतलब ये है कि किसी भी caste में you have what we call subcastes. Right? Okay. Now, I'll just share with you the definition. So definition I've already shared. In relation to features, I will stick to what was not in the recent NCRT, but in the previous NCRT. So there is an old prominent sociologist of India, Ghurye, G.S. Ghurye, and he has written an entire chapter on features of caste system. So I'll just quickly share with you very briefly. That's a long chapter. So Ghurye writes about 6 features. 6 features of caste system. This is from his book, Caste and Race in India. This was a book that was published in 1932. And in this particular book, there's an entire chapter devoted to features of caste system. And he has the following to say. The first feature is, and you can write this down, segmental division of society. Segmental division of society. What does that mean? Yes, but what is this segmental division of society? Yes, society is divided into smaller segments, but how does the society get divided into smaller segments? कैसे? अरे भाई एक सेकंड रुको. Horizontal division कैसे? It is, so the argument that you're giving, I don't know whether you're aware of it, that's an argument that is given by a sociologist much later, which is called Hierarchy and Difference by Dipankar Gupta. But Ghurye does not go into that. Segmental, आप कुछ कह रहे थे, आप, you were saying, sorry, बताइए. Occupation भी कह सकते हैं, but वो भी बाद में आएगा. इसको ऐसे समझिए, every caste has elaborate rituals vis-a-vis day-to-day living. So if you were to run into a horrendous casteist person, this person can tell you by the way a man wears his dhoti, the caste of that person. And people are also aware that if they belong to caste A, they cannot wear their dhoti the way caste B people wear their dhoti. So that's, this is really intricate stuff. This is pathological, but this is what it is. So the ways in which lower caste women will wear sari, and the ways in which upper caste women will wear sari, and the ways in which, lower caste men will remain bare-chested, and upper caste men will remain clothed and attired and so on. This is all very elaborate. So the food, the dresses, the rituals, the customs, and then of course occupation. So what caste is doing is it is dividing the society into different segments. In other words, every caste offers a specific way of life. Get it? Segmental division of society. So every caste has its own peculiar. So I'm not dictating all of this. I'm sure you get the gist of it. So just jot down, I think, the keywords here. Okay, so that's the first thing, segmental division of society. The second is hierarchical arrangement of society. Now this is again clear. Hierarchy. What is hierarchy? पहले तो आप लोग बोलते नहीं हैं और फिर जब बोलते हैं तो एक साथ 6 लोग बोलते हैं. रुकिए, आप बताइए. Okay, you were saying castes are cat. Oh, groups. तो ठीक है. हाँ, ठीक. You were saying? Anyone else? You were saying? Yeah, so hierarchy in that sense is an arrangement, and it's a vertical arrangement. It's an arrangement wherein privileges, entitlements, and obligations are distributed disproportionately. Kaise? So those who are up the hierarchy always avail maximum concession. इसको ऐसे समझिए. We just spoke about caste and occupation connection. Take. So if you go ahead with a very commonsensical understanding of caste, the Brahmins at the top and the untouchables down the hierarchy, is the Brahmin really under an obligation to be a Brahmin? Yes, no. No. अरे बहुत मुश्किल हो जाएगी भाई. No. No, he's not. That's the point. See, a Brahmin son can always do engineering, can always go to Silicon Valley, do all kinds of things, right? Now, if a Brahmin wants to be a Brahmin, as in a priest, fair enough. but that's not really the case. And similarly, in relation to Kshatriyas, I'm working with the Varn framework right now, Kshatriyas, and also to an extent the Vaishyas. But the moment you get into the service castes, when you're talking about Shudras, so if you think about the carpenters, the potters, the weavers, the artisans, for the most part, they remain under the burden of that obligation. And if you go further down, which is the untouchables, right? The Avarn, the outside Varn people, the obligation is absolutely uncompromisable. You have to do what your father, grandfather, and so on have been doing. So, what is happening is the burden is more on those who are down the hierarchy. और ये हर hierarchy के साथ है. This is hierarchy on the basis of caste. Think about hierarchy on the basis of gender, right? A very simplistic hierarchy. I'm not getting into the spectrum, which is LGBTQI plus, A plus. But just male, female, if you work with that. So if male, not if, male are privileged, right? So there are all kinds of concessions. Whereas females are not privileged, there are all kinds of burden. So it's the responsibility of women to do a lot of things vis-a-vis society's moral compass, etc. Whereas men can just flout the rules as and when they please. So the concession will always be offered to those who are up the hierarchy, and there will be more expectation from those who are down the hierarchy, the burden. So let's come back to this Ghurye's second feature, hierarchical arrangement. Hierarchy, simply put, vertical arrangement of ranking of groups in a way that privileges and obligations are distributed disproportionately. कुछ लोगों के लिए ज़्यादा है, कुछ लोगों के लिए कम है, बराबरी से नहीं है. और हायरार्की में आप जितना ऊपर हैं, आपके लिए उतना ही ज़्यादा रिलैक्सेशन है, आप जितना नीचे हैं, आपके लिए उतनी ही बंदिश है. The more down the further down you are in the hierarchy, the more restrictions you have to face. So that's the second thing, hierarchical division. The third is restrictions on feeding and social intercourse. Restrictions on feeding. अब यहाँ पर आता है खाने का मामला. So generally speaking, people think when they say food as a basic need, we think food is simply food. You get it, you have it, you enjoy it. No. Actually, food is a ridiculously elaborate category in anthropology and sociology. There's an entire anthropology of food. There's an entire sociology of food. कौन देता है, कौन बनाता है, कहाँ उगता है, किससे लेते हैं, किससे नहीं लेते हैं. It's just an endless world in itself. But here, we have to understand that there are taboos, there are restrictions in relation to who can give food to whom. Okay? In this context, Ghurye informs us about two categories within food. So there is kacha food and there is pakka food. Any idea? How does he elaborate on these? कच्चा क्या है? यही तो कॉमन सेंस आप लोगों का जो है ना, मतलब कच्चा मतलब कच्चा और पक्का मतलब पक्का. It's as simple as that. Sorry? हाँ वही 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 कह रहे हैं लोग. Uncooked. No, we'll come to that later. I just want to know, how do you look at the distinction? What do you think possibly implies? Kacha, what does kacha imply? So, एक सेकेंड. नहीं, सेकेंड. ना ना ना, छोड़ दीजिए ये सब क्वालिटी. नहीं नहीं, लेट्स स्टॉप इट हियर बिकॉज आई डोंट थिंक इट्स गोइंग एनीवेयर. बताइए. आई nowhere, not even galaxies close to the point. Huh? नहीं. I'm sorry, I really find this embarrassing. मैं आप लोगों को बार बार demean कर रहा हूँ. बताइए. You won't get it. Close, but अभी भी नहीं. That's still hope, right? So kacha food is basically food that is boiled. So it's basically, the distinction is between cooked food and boiled food, right? So any food wherein the preparation involves ghee or oil or whatever, is pakka food. That's Ghurye's thing, right? That's the caste anthropology connections in relation to food. And the food, not raw, but food that is boiled. So that's kacha food, right? Now, what he tells us is that in any case, we know that there are certain kinds of food that are prescribed and there are certain kinds of food that are proscribed, meaning कुछ खाने हैं जो आपके लिए बेहतर है और कुछ खाना है जो मना है. Now, in the typical caste hierarchy, there's a certain understanding of what we call pure food and impure food. So, for example, not rigorously followed, but for example, vegetarianism and non-vegetarianism, alcoholism and teetotalism, and so on. So this will tell us who is where. So for example, the untouchables are apparently meat eaters, and therefore a certain impurity that is associated with them on the basis of their dietary practices. Whereas the Brahmins allegedly are vegetarians, and therefore a certain claim to purity. So पहली चीज तो ये कि कुछ खाने हैं जो नहीं खाने और कुछ हैं जो खाने. So that's the first distinction. But it does not end there. Uske baad se it only gets more elaborate and it gets more nuanced. So as a rule, everyone can accept food from a Brahmin. Kacha, pakka, kuch bhi. The Brahmin can just serve you whenever, wherever. So everyone can accept food from a Brahmin, but a Brahmin cannot accept any cooked food from others. So basically, up the hierarchy, जो ऊपर है वो अपने नीचे वालों को दे सकता है, right? But नीचे वाले, so Brahmin cannot take cooked food from any of the down the hierarchy groups. So that's point number one. So this kacha food and pakka food, a man will never eat kacha food unless it is prepared by a fellow caste member. So kacha food you only take from your own caste members. Pakka food you can take from those who are up the hierarchy for the most part. So all twice bonds, अब ये twice bond भी एक reference है. You know about this? Yes. Let me just write this now. So you have Brahmins, Kshatriyas, and then so basically this is the Varn, the fourfold Varn system, and these three are called the twice born because there is a ritual, there's a thread wearing ceremony that is only restricted to these three groups, the first three, and they are also called Savarn, right? So the Shudras are essentially polluted, but the untouchables are even more polluted than the Shudras. So Ghurye is telling us that all twice borns can take kacha food from Brahmins. All you need to do is just get the hierarchy. जो नीचे है अपने से ऊपर वाले से कच्चा फूड ले सकते, मतलब Brahmin can actually serve anyone. It's a different story that Brahmins do not want to serve anyone, but you know they can. Recently, you might be aware of the Lingayat issue that's going on. The Lingayats essentially make this claim that we will not take food from Brahmins, as if the Brahmins want to serve them. But the point, it's not about whether Brahmins want to serve them or not. The point is, what is it that the Lingayats are trying to prove by saying that we will not take food from Brahmins? What they're trying to argue for is that we are even superior to Brahmins. And as of now, of course, this is an earlier claim. Now, of course, they're making a case for a separate the status of a separate religious community. Okay. So this is about food. So basically just bataiye. Yes. So this is an early, which is what I said. This is a 1932 reference. You are referring to the meat eating thing. Yeah. So these are regional variants of Brahmins, right? So there are the Bengali Brahmins. Why are you forgetting them? and Brahmins across Northeast. So, in that sense, there are later anthropological works that tell us that dietary practices have not to do with rituals as much as they have to do with regions, right? Sorry? Yeah. So, the regional geographical parameters become more important in terms of. So, this is a variety within the Brahmins of the subcontinent, right? So whether we are looking at Brahmins of South, not all, but particularly, let's say if you're looking at the Kerala Brahmins, and then we are looking at Odisha, Bengal, even Jharkhand, uh, Kashmir, and so on. So we have a few pointers here just for our understanding that there is kacha food, there is pakka food, there are castes that can serve kacha food only to their own members. So kacha food you can only take from your own members. Pakka food you can take from those who are above you and not below you. Brahmins will not take pakka food from anyone. Brahmins can give food to anyone and everyone, and so on. So again, just to understand how ridiculously elaborate and at the same time annoying all these things are. But this is what it is, and much to our surprise, quite a few people still follow it. Right? Don't be under the assumption, yes, we are not that progressive, my friend. Please bear with me. It is not really as horrible, maybe, as it used to be several decades ago, but it is still there. It's still there. The situation is not very exciting even now. Okay, the third, ये कौन सा था point ये? तीसरा? ये था third. So the fourth is restrictions on marriage, which is endogamy. ये मैं हटा रहा हूँ फिर सारा का सारा. So restrictions on marriage. This requires a bit of elaboration. So this is called endogamy. Now, endogamy is marrying within the group. However, there have been instances of marrying outside the group. So when you marry outside the group, there are two possible expressions. One is hypogamy. The other is anyone would care to elaborate on these? Hyper, बताइए जी. A male member marrying. Let's first get the reference. Reference point क्या है? औरत है reference point या मर्द है? आप बताना चाहेंगे? हाइपर में, बिकॉज हाइपर का मतलब है ऊपर, और हाइपो, तो ये ऊपर किसके लिए इस्तेमाल हो रहा है? बिकॉज दैट विल परहैप्स पुट टू रेस्ट ऑल कंफ्यूजन. बताइए. By nature, what does that mean? फिल्म्स में तो ऐसा नहीं दिखाते हैं. फिल्म्स में दे एंड अप मैरिंग लूजर्स ऑल द. सॉरी, दिया. ओके, बट देन लेट्स कम बैक टू द क्वेश्चन. हाइपरगेमी होगा क्या और हाइपोगेमी क्या होगा? So get the first reference in place. They conceptually something that will be of extreme significance. The reference is woman. If you have the reference in place, then I don't think there is any reason to worry. So if you get the core conceptual reference, women है parameter, तो अब hypergamy हो जाएगा when a woman of a relatively lower caste is married into an upper caste or an upper ranked group. That's a case of hypergamy. ठीक? तो इसमें आप अब ये इसको घुमा के मत करिएगा कि इसी को हमने. So let's just, so in again in sociology, anthropology, reference is women, और यहाँ से ही शुरू होगा. So hypergamy, clear? Hypogamy uska ulta. So when a woman of an upper caste or a relatively upper ranking is married into a group that is of a ritually lower status, that's a case of hypogamy. Now the question for you is, think about it. ज़्यादा instances किसके हैं? तो एंडोगमी तो होता है. एक सेकेंड, एंडोगमी है, देर इज नो डिनाइंग दैट, बट एंडोगमी के साथ साथ people are telling us, scholars are telling us, we have instances of hypergamy, hypogamy. Now for us, it's for us to figure out क्या ज़्यादा है. कोई इस पे डेटा नहीं है, but just on the basis of our understanding, हाइपो. भाई एक सेकेंड, हाइपर वाले ज़रा बताइए, हाथ खड़े करिए आप लोग, डरिए मत. अरे बस घबरा क्यों रहे हैं भाई, इस पर कोई एफआईआर थोड़ी ना हो जाएगी. हाइपर एंड हाइपो में ऑल राइट. सो व्हाई डोंट यू टेल अस, व्हाई डू यू थिंक हाइपोगेमी के ज़्यादा होंगे? ऑल राइट, कौन है और हाइपोगेमी वाला बताइए, उससे ही पूछ. नहीं नहीं, अभी वेट वेट, लेट्स गेट द हाइपोगेमी स्टफ सॉर्टेड. कोई बोलना चाहेगा कि व्हाई इंस्टेंसेस ऑफ हाइपोगेमी आर हायर? नहीं, कोई चांस ही नहीं है हाइपोगेमी का. सो व्हाई हाइपरगेमी, बताइए. या fair enough, but there is more to it. Think about it. बताइए. Well, yes, of course, that's the case. Hypergamy is, I wouldn't say it's the norm, but yeah, it's still something that's acceptable. Usually, तो endogamy is the norm, marrying within. But अगर exception होगा तो hypergamy में ज़्यादा पाया जाएगा, hypogamy में कम. But इसकी एक और भी वजह है. Because you refer to patriarchy, try and think about it from the vantage point of, because there's a way in which caste and patriarchy work together. नहीं, वो तो इन्होंने बताया. That is one of the reasons. So, that is yes. Not really. मतलब one can push for this argument, but इतना आगे नहीं जाएंगे. मतलब एग्जामिनर परेशान हो जाएगा इतनी कॉम्प्लिकेटेड चीज़ों में. See, there is a distinction in India. Again, there's a distinction when it comes to marriage. There's a distinction between what we call wife givers and wife takers. Right? लड़के वाले और लड़की वाले. तो जब आप किसी भी गलती से अगर आप किसी शादी में मौजूद हैं और आप देखें बारात को लेके द मैडनेस, वो क्या कहते हैं, वो हार वार लेके लोग खड़े हो जाते हैं और बाराती में से कभी इनवेरिएबली वो नाराज़ हो जाते हैं. मतलब ठंडी रोटी है और ये गर्म नहीं है, एटसेट्रा. सो द बारातीज आर जस्ट मोरॉनिक, राइट? दे एक्चुअली एंटर विद अ लॉट ऑफ एंटाइटलमेंट. क्या किसी को एक फूल नहीं दिया या किसी के ऊपर वो छिड़काव नहीं किया तो वो दे एंड अप कंप्लेनिंग कि ये सही नहीं था. Now, why is that? They have not done anthropology. उनको कुछ अंदाज़ा नहीं इन सब चीज़ों का. But this is essentially what, because they are wife takers. So the wife takers are always, fortunately, unfortunately, they are always superior to wife givers. And in Hindi cinema at one point of time, this used to be the opening shot, that the Bharat has come and then suddenly, because of some revelation, the boy's family, the groom's family says, हमें शादी नहीं करनी है. And then the bride's father would come, वो अपना पगड़ उठा के जो है उनके पैर में रख देगा कि ये मत कीजिए आप, बारात वापस नहीं जानी चाहिए, बिकॉज हमारी तो इज्जत ही खत्म हो जाएगी ना. दिस इज अ वेरी, it's a very mainstream narrative of the 1970s cinema, right? Left, right, and center. Every second film started with this obnoxious opening shot. So wife givers, wife takers, think about hypergamy and then think about who is the wife giver and who is the wife taker. And then it makes sense. So in hypergamy, there is no conflict. Who's the wife taker? the upper caste. And who's the wife giver? The lower caste. So there's no conflict. It's settled. It's actually double exploitation. It works. It serves the purpose. But in hypogamy, there is a problem. In hypogamy, what's happening is the wife giver is essentially an upper caste, and the wife taker is a relatively lower caste. And that contributes to or amounts to tension and violence and honor killings, precisely. Think about any of the news of honor killing. What's the case? Invariably, the girl is a dominant caste girl who has to run with the lower caste Dalit boy. That's the case. Honor killing में ये कभी नहीं हुआ है आज तक कि दलित लड़की एक dominant caste लड़के के साथ भाग गई हो. Unheard of. It has never happened. So think about any of the CAP proceedings. This is what exactly happens. The dominant caste girl elopes with a Dalit boy, and then they are chased, and then they are brought down, brought back, and they are hacked or burnt alive or butchered. All kinds of crazy ideas they have. So that's honor killing. And why is this honor killing? Because the woman is the carrier of honor. So if the girl runs away, then the honor is also gone. So basically, the honor of the dominant caste community is compromised. So if a Jat girl runs away with a Dalit boy, the Jat honor is compromised. So the killing is in the name of the honor. Honor killing, right? Okay, let's come. So you get this, right? Hypogamy, and hypergamy. There are very few instances of hypogamy because of what I just pointed out. And there are numerous instances of hypergamy in classical literature. Think about Shakuntala, for example. Of course, that's also to do with tribe caste, in the sense a Kshatriya king is marrying a tribal, girl. But there are so many instances where the king would just go and end up marrying a woman who is essentially not of his caste. But never. So that's the hypogamy case, as I said, few cases. But hypergamy is something that works, and it works because of the syncing that happens between patriarchy and caste. The wife giver or wife taker ka distinction you should get, and that should help you understand why we have more instances of hypergamy and very few instances of hypogamy. And then traditional occupation, the next pointer. So basically, lack of choice in terms of the occupation that you can choose. That's the fifth pointer, I believe. So every caste has a certain occupation, but as I pointed out earlier, the choice is more for upper castes, and the choice is less or negligible for lower castes. You are an untouchable, you are doomed. You are an upper caste, you have all kinds of possibilities, right? So although we say traditional occupation, but we need to keep this in mind, that this is disproportionate. It is not in equal measure for everyone. So for few caste groups, there is more restriction, whereas for few caste groups, there is hardly any restriction. You want to carry on with your traditional occupation, do it. You do not want to carry on, excellent, no worries. But for Shudras and untouchables, that is not really the case. And lastly, civil and religious disabilities. Civil, matlab rozana ke zindagi mein, you will not, if you belong to a certain caste group which happens to be down the hierarchy, you will not be able to do things the normal way. So for example, there is a road, and the road is meant to be walked on, right? But just because you happen to be of a certain caste, you can't walk down that road all the time. Now you might be thinking, that is this really the case? Believe me, it's still the case in several villages of India. And we keep hearing about this appalling stuff very often through newspapers. So recently there was a case in Tamil Nadu. There were several schools that were, as a matter of routine, getting the school toilets cleaned by Dalit students. These are government schools. So the Dalit students were regularly cleaning toilets. This is 2024, right? There are still villages where Dalits cannot really, in fact, you might have also heard that Dalits not being allowed to ride horses, Dalits not being allowed to wear sunglasses, in, of course, in localities, right? Because these are things that they are not supposed to do. Who has almost a birthright to ride a horse? Excellent. So if a Dalit does that, in for trouble. So this is still happening, right? In fact, I think a few years ago there was a major coverage of an incident where there was a Dalit groom who wanted to ride a horse on the occasion of his marriage, but was beaten up mercilessly by the upper caste, dominant caste folks. So this is what we call civil disabilities. Disability ka yahan pe matlab ye, you can do it, but you will not be allowed to do it, right? You can very well ride a horse, or you can at least learn how to ride a horse, but you will not be allowed to. So that's disability. There is a well, there is a tap, you can very well use it and quench your thirst, but you will not. So that's a certain disability on your part. And similarly, what we call religious disabilities. So of course, particularly in relation to temple entry, but also in terms of rituals. That an untouchable dead body will not really be, it won't really have the same, in anthropology we say rites of passage. मतलब उस तरीके के rituals उस dead body के साथ नहीं होंगे जैसे कि एक savant body के साथ होंगे. So there are all kinds of religious disabilities and civil disabilities. So these are the 6 features that Ghurye extensively speaks about. Segmental division of society, hierarchy, endogamy, food restrictions on food and social intercourse, civil and religious disabilities, and occupation. Clear? Any question related to this? नहीं? बताइए. Supreme sources, बाप रे इतना भारी लफ्ज आप इस्तेमाल कर रहे हैं. Well, Ghurye essentially borrowed from classical scriptures. So these are all the Shastras particularly, and Ghurye was an uncompromised Sanskritist. So he borrowed from classical scriptures. But as we go, we will question these. ये तो हो गया हमारा एक जिसको कहते हैं conventional understanding. So just features of caste system. But of course, subsequently people have questioned. So I'll just quickly draw your attention to some of the new developments in relation to understanding of caste. This is a conventional understanding. It'll help you out if you have to simply write it down. But of course, caste is dynamic and there are all kinds of new things happening. So let's try and understand. So that brings me to a very important distinction between book view of caste. तो ये जो अभी हमने बात की, ये काफी हद तक book view है, right? It's a textual understanding. And the other, of course, is field view. फील्ड व्यू यानी जो एथनोग्राफी या फील्ड वर्कर हमारे सोशियोलॉजिस्ट एंथ्रोपोलॉजिस्ट, तो फील्ड व्यू और बुक व्यू को ऐसे समझिए. फॉर एग्जांपल, इफ वन वर टू, आई एम जस्ट गिविंग एन एग्जांपल, इफ वन वर टू understand Muslim society, right, and were to simply sit in a corner and read the Quran from start to finish, and on the basis of that write a certain treatise, a certain tract. Now, this is the classic case of what we call book view, because much of what the Quran says, the Muslims don't care. Right? Excellent. Muslims don't know, they don't care. A lot of things they care about more, a lot of things they don't care. So, long story short, Quran does not really help us understand what a Muslim society is like. It helps us understand what a Muslim society ideally should be like. So a text will always give you what we call an ought to be, an ideal picture. But if the same person were to kind of roam around and go to different Muslim settlements, Muslim, let's not say Muslim, but just societies, and interact with various Muslim folks, observe their behavior, observe their rituals, their festivities, then that would be an incredibly vibrant, dynamic study. Now, this is what we call a field view. So, through field view, you will say Muslims are casteist. Through field view, you will say that Bengali Muslims are actually closer to Bengali Hindus as compared to UP Muslims. Through field view, you will say the Mapila Muslims have got nothing to do with the UP Muslims and so on. Now, this is all field view. But the book view will tell us that all Muslims do this, all Muslims do that, all Muslims don't do that. Utter nonsense. Doesn't work. So that's an important distinction. So whatever we have discussed so far, unfortunately, is book view. Because ये तो किताबों में है. But if you were to go around and generally observe caste practices, rituals, traditions, interdependence, etc., is it really the case? Right? क्या caste और occupation का रिश्ता बहुत strong है अभी भी? क्या caste और ritual का रिश्ता अभी भी strong है? Is hierarchy really that important? So these are some of the questions that scholars have. So we are now, so book view we've done. Let's just quickly look at the field view of caste. Now, in relation to field view, there are two things that I just want to quickly draw your attention to. So this is, book view is Ghurye. Field view is Srinivas. Of course, there are many more, but I'll just use two references. तो अभी पीछे हम लोगों ने बताया कास्ट के बारे में क्लोज्ड सिस्टम, ये कहा था मैंने, which means no mobility. But Srinivas says, Srinivas contests the proposition. Right? He contests it. So he does not agree with this idea that caste system is a closed system of stratification. Kaise? He says, and he refers to a very interesting process that's been in practice for centuries, and he calls it Sanskritization. So you can either use a Z or an S, just be consistent. So this S is British system, Z is American. But if you use Z, then just use Z all the time. There's no hopping around here. So either of the two. Sanskritization, Srinivas has used Z, right? Although he was trained in England, but for some reason he has used Z in his writings. So Sanskritization, simply put, is a process. It's a process that tells us about change and mobility in caste system. क्या होता है इस process में? Members of a lower caste community imitate the rituals, customs, and practices of a immediately superior ranked caste community in order to attain mobility. So this is simply about members of a lower caste community imitating, emulating the traditions and customs of an immediate superior caste in order to attain mobility. Take. At times it happens within a generation, at times it happens in 2 generations, and there have been instances wherein it has taken 3 generations. But, long story short, mobility has happened. And Srinivas has given numerous examples of what we call Sanskritized castes. अब आप कैसे करते हैं? So for example, there are 2 very important references. You quit eating meat and you quit drinking alcohol, because that's the quickest way to sort of make a case for pure living, because vegetarianism is associated with a certain puritanical living, and also teetotalism, meaning no alcohol consumption, is also associated with the pure castes. So what you do is you don't eat non-vegetarian food, so you quit consuming meat and you quit drinking alcohol. That's your starting point. And then there are, of course, other things that you do. But as Srinivas says, that depending on the severity, हर जगह पे ज़रूरी नहीं है कि हर जगह caste restrictions उतनी हो. There are areas where caste restrictions are relatively relaxed, and there are areas where caste restrictions are quite particular and very stringent. So in one of the settings, it might take 3 generations for a caste to become Sanskritized and acquire an upper status. In another setup, it might just happen within a generation. But as I said, gist iska ye hai that there is mobility in caste system. In other words, it is not necessary that you, if you were to born in caste A, you also die as a member of caste A. Now that's a phenomenal understanding, and that is coming from field. Srinivas ne ye cheez dekhi कि कैसे from one generation to another. So how it happens is, and he uses a very interesting phrase, you can perhaps remember this phrase, that every caste considers itself superior to its equals and equal to its superiors. That's the phrase. That's a brilliant phrase. That every caste considers itself superior to its equals and equal to its superiors. क्या समझ में आ रहा है आपको इससे? बताइए. Exactly. So it is to do with, he's basically talking about a very fundamental psychological attribute. So his argument is that people are not very chilled out about the fact that they are down the hierarchy. Kuch to, but again, he's also very logical. He's not, please be very clear about this. He's not talking about extreme mobility. So if you're working with a certain framework like this, he is not saying ye mobility or that's not happening. An untouchable becoming a Brahmin, forget it. You know, even eternity will fall short of time. That's not happening. But what he is recommending is that there are immediate leaps, right? So an untouchable becoming a Brahmin, unheard of, cannot happen. But yes, somebody from, let's say, Shudra community entering into the twice born, somebody from the twice born lower rung entering into a slightly upper rung, that can always happen, has happened. So please, so it's a very logical thing that he is making a case for. He's not talking about extreme change, because extreme change to mumkin hi nahi hai. That's completely out of the window. But as far as the gradual thing is concerned, that is something that Srinivas is making a case for. And remember, so just to illustrate, let's say we are talking about a particular caste. So in D, let's say you have D1, D2, D3, D4, etc. These are subcastes. Now within one of these, so D4 mein, let's say you have 100 people. Now of these 100 people, there are 20 who are better off. बस सारे लोग तो एक स्टेटस पे नहीं होते हैं. Let's say there are 20 who have more, who are economically better off. Some of them are more educated. Now suddenly what happens is these 20 begin to think about themselves as superior to their equals and equal to their superior. So remember, not the entire caste will just switch from one to another. ये नहीं होगा कि मतलब fill in the blanks type situation नहीं है. It's about few families. Right? You won't have the entire D4 disappearing from the scene. No. You will have a few families, because there are few families that have perhaps done well. They are more prosperous as compared to other families. So these people then begin to imitate and imitate and imitate. And then in a generation or another generation or 3 generations, they will find themselves in an upper layer of the caste order. So that's the first reference, Sanskritization. Bataiye. No, that's not the, so the actual criticism is that the ideology remains. Caste to nahi rahi same, kyunki even subcaste mein bhi divisions hain. See, within a caste, to give you an example, let's say if you're talking about the Potter caste, ठीक? Now Potter caste, we might think Potter कौन है भाई? कुम्हार है. कुम्हार कौन है जो मट्टी के बर्तन बनाता है? But that's not really it. There is more to it. What else? So basically Potter is a broader reference. अब इसमें कुछ लोग हैं जो मट्टी लाते हैं, कुछ लोग हैं जो मट्टी गूंदने के एक्सपर्ट हैं, और कुछ लोग हैं जो व्हील पे काम करते हैं. So the artisan potter is essentially a subcaste within the broader Shudra caste of potters. And they follow endogamy within subcastes, by the way. तो आप इसको ऐसे समझिए कि D1, D2, D3, D4 इसकी अपनी एक हायरार्की है. And in all likelihood, D2 will not marry into D4. So endogamy is also practiced here, and hypergamy also. So if you go from D4 to D3, or if you go from D1 to some other C, that is definitely mobility. But इस पे सवाल ये कर सकते हैं that the ideology remains. Ideology remains का क्या मतलब है? Why on earth do you want to imitate the rituals and customs and traditions of an upper caste? Because you believe that the upper caste is an upper caste. मतलब the ideology remains. तो इसको मैं इस डिटेल में नहीं जाना चाहता हूँ, but the argument that is given is it is simply about positional change and not structural change. यानी position तो बदल गई, but end of the day structure नहीं बदला. So caste as a structure remains, but within that structure there is some change that's happening. It is, so according to Srinivas, it is pan-Indian in the sense that in different localities you have Sanskritization in different forms. But the caste that people emulate, they differ from one case to another. Right? So it is something that is to be found across caste systems in India. Okay, तो एक चीज तो इन्होंने बता दी हमें Sanskritization, and the other thing which to my mind is the most important reference in caste studies is dominant caste. That's the other reference that he. So very quickly, let's also, because this is about contemporary understanding of caste. तो किताबों में जो in ancient scriptures, when people were talking about dominant caste, कौन सी caste थी वो? Brahmins. Yes. So the basis of dominance was ritualistic hierarchy. या ritual status. आपकी dominance की basis क्या है? ऋग्वेद का एक श्लोक है, एक वर्स है जिसकी बेसिस पे पता चलता है that several people came from the mouth of the primeval being, and then people came from shoulder, then people came from thighs, and then people came from feet. And that's the way in which we understand the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, the Vaishyas, and the Shudras. तो ये हो गया ritual status. But यहाँ जो वो dominant कह रहे हैं, it's got nothing to do with ritual status. Srinivas is essentially telling us about a very important development. So when India became independent, a lot of people thought that caste will disappear. How foolish of them. They thought कि भाई अब तो हम democracy हो गए, and we are now an independent country, and there is the constitution, and there is preamble, and there are fundamental rights, and there's no end to that, right? So, long story short, caste will gradually disappear. And Ghurye believed that with English education, caste will disappear. And he himself was quite casteist and English educated. So anyways, some of these folks did not get it right. They thought कि भाई हम लोग पढ़े लिख जाएंगे तो caste चली जाएगी. As if educated people are not casteist. Of course they are. Most of the educated people are casteist, unfortunately. Srinivas was the only person, in fact, he was the first person who said that with democracy, caste is only going to acquire a new version. In fact, he said that with democracy, caste is going to become more and more relevant. Kaise? Democracy is something that's to do with numbers. Take? Now, if you're thinking about numbers, caste groups also work with numbers. So if now suddenly what happens is the entire caste politics, let's not use the word caste politics, the entire caste situation changes. So if you look at the Hindu social order, the Brahmins are roughly about 3%. And that's also an exaggerated claim. 3% of the entire Hindu social order. And the Savarn, which is the Brahmins, just the Varn logic, the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, and the Vaishyas put together, that's not even 15% of the entire social order. 15 to 18% max. What's left? The OBCs, which is the Shudras for the most part. That's roughly about 50%. It's quite a population. And then of course the SCs of course are not part of the Hindu social order. So in terms of numbers, suddenly what is happening is that people who were ritually not up have actually acquired a certain power. So in any constituency, there is a possibility that a Shudra community people outnumber the Brahmins. There is a possibility because the Brahmins are in any case far and few. They are not even 3%. So democratically speaking, Brahmins are going to lose the race, actually, the battle. So this is something that Srinivas talks about. When he talks about dominant caste, the first thing that he refers to is what he calls numerical strength. यानी डोमिनेंस को डिफाइन करने का सबसे पहला पैमाना, the first parameter is numbers. And you cannot think of dominance in a democracy without thinking of numbers. So numerical strength, सबसे पहली चीज. Now, जैसे ही आपने numerical strength बोला, the Brahmins are completely out of the picture. So he is talking about a completely new idea of dominance. Number one, dominant caste के लिए numerical strength. Number two, he says economic power. Now for economic power, the parameter that he has is ownership of cultivable land. Land ownership. Right? The peasants, they come from which caste? The farmers? The Shudras. They are the artisan, the occupational castes. So if you think about some of the dominant castes of contemporary India, कौन सी हैं dominant castes? Jats, yes. Yes. आगे चलिए. यूपी बिहार में ही रह जाएंगे क्या? थोड़ा और बताइए. Oh, well, yes, but चलिए ठीक है. What else? The Pattidars, the Marathas, the Kurmis, the Reddys, the Okaligas, they are all dominant castes. And remember, they are all farming castes. They are landowning castes. So the Jats are a predominantly landowning community, right? So एक तो numerical strength है. इसके साथ ही साथ there is economic power. And economic power का यहाँ पे, it's got nothing to do with multinational corporate job, no. Land ownership. And land ownership, arable, cultivable land. So that's the second thing. And the third, which of course is a result of the first two, is political power. तो अगर आपके पास numerical strength है और आपके पास economic power है, तो फिर जाहिर है this translates into. Now these three happen to be the most defining characteristics of dominant caste according to Srinivas. He has 6, but these three are the most defining. इसके अलावा he refers to Western education, या non-traditional education, that's point number 4. Then he refers to government job, या कम से कम urban jobs, urban sources of income. And lastly, he refers to ritual status in hierarchy. अब इसको समझने की ज़रूरत है. So, for example, let's say there are 2 castes and they are very close to each other in terms of numerical strength. They are very close to each other in terms of economic power. They are very close to each other in terms of political power. But इसमें अब, let's say it's a close contest, right? What is it that will define one of them as dominant? तो आखिरी, but nonetheless, जिसको कहते हैं ये आखिरी आलू है. तो जो आखिरी आलू डाल के 1 किलो हो जाता है, तो इसका ये मतलब नहीं कि वो एक आलू 1 किलो का है. But it is something that completely turns the scales. So ritual status, so for example, 2 castes. So let's say there is a caste C1 and there is a caste C2. ये दोनों बिल्कुल neck to neck हैं, but ritual status में C1 is above. So the eventual dominance is of C1. So Western education, non-traditional education, urban sources of income या government job, और ये 3. लेकिन श्रीनिवास ने बहुत clearly कहा that although there are 6 features, These three are the defining features: numerical strength, economic power, and political power. Any question? बताइए. Yes. What is the psychological factor? हाँ, बताइए. हाँ, but that's not really ingrained in the OBCs. See, actually what happens in any discourse, in any, क्या कहेंगे, theory building, is that there are stages. तो शुरू में किसी ने बोला, फिर उसके बाद से श्रीनिवास ने बोला. Today, when we discuss Sanskritization, is something that's also questioned because many OBCs, for example, if you think about the Jats are absolutely chilled out about the fact that they are Jats. They do not want any mobility. Yeah, so you think of any dominant caste, although rank-wise Shudras, but in terms of attitude, good Lord, कोई मतलब उसमें कुछ नहीं, वो कार पे भी लिख रखा है, घर के बाहर भी लिख रखा है. They are absolutely unapologetic about the fact that they are Jats or they are Reddys or they are Yadavs and so on. So the Sanskritization thesis also does not work after a point. This is simply about understanding the discourse कि घुरे ने ये बोला, फिर उसके बाद से ऐसे. To go back to your point, see, OBCs actually do not want to get into the Sanskritization nonsense. They are absolutely clear about the fact that they are the most powerful lot in India right now because they have the numbers. So they are very powerful in regional politics. If you cannot think of regionalism without thinking of the OBC phenomenon, you cannot think of Green Revolution's narrative without thinking of the OBCs, and you also cannot think of contemporary caste politics without thinking of the OBCs. So they are, in many ways, they either break the deal or they make the deal, right? They are a very important faction. No political party can afford to ignore the OBC. It's quite a phenomenon. And Satish Deshpande brilliantly writes that the OBCs were to form a country, it would very well be the third largest country of the world. That's 50% of India. That's no joke. क्योंकि इंडिया के बाद तो बहुत नीचे हैं ना लोग. ऐसा थोड़ी ना है कि चाइना इंडिया का था कि कुछ करोड़ में आसपास हो जाएगा. No. So the OBCs actually are the third largest country of the world. So in that sense, the Sanskritization logic does not work with reference to the OBCs. So dominant caste is a very important reference to understand caste democracy connections. Democracy के आने के बाद से caste में क्या बदलाव आए हैं, this you understand through dominant caste. And it is still, although referred to in the 1950s, but still relevant and quite relevant. You cannot think of contemporary Indian politics without thinking about dominant caste. अभी पीछे ही reservation को लेकर के ये जो पट्टीदार Maratha agitation 2016 में भी हुआ था ये. Every now and then these dominant caste people actually make a case for more reservation, right? Which is of course a serious problem. But they know that they can get away with it because they have the numbers. You know, they can actually bring down the entire state to a standstill. Right? That's what the Jats can do. That's what the Gurjars can do. That's what the Marathas can do because they have numbers at their disposal. They can actually dictate the state machinery to do whatever as per their own whims and fancies. And the state machinery has no other option but to pay heed to what they are demanding. Bataiye. Yeah, so creamy layer I was thinking of discussing a little later, but which is to be looked at in relation to a more specific theme, which is called subcategorization of OBCs. So this whole debate around subcategorization is around creamy layer, but that is something that I'll take up a bit later, right? But just in case I don't, please remind me, but that's part of the plan. I will look into it when we get into more contemporary issues. Okay, lastly, there are 3-4 changes that have also happened. So features pata chal gaye, some of the important new developments like Sanskritization, dominant caste. Then there is another sociologist who helps us understand. He simply says that, you know, some of the changes that we cannot afford to miss. Andre Bete, and he points out three important domains जहां पर changes हुए हैं. So he refers to one in relation to purity and pollution. कि in matters में things have become more relaxed. He's not saying that this is not there. He's saying that the instances have really gone down. Purity and pollution. That rules relating to purity and pollution are becoming less and less stringent. So there is some positive development on that front. इसकी वजह उन्होंने he has used a word that you can just एक चीज उन्होंने बताई है secularization. We'll come to this later because आगे जा करके इसको डिस्कस करना है. But he says as a result of secularization people have become less ritualistic, and because of people becoming less ritualistic, purity and pollution is not really as widespread as it used to be earlier. So that's point number one. The second point that he refers to is regulation of marriage. And he says that there is more autonomy in relation to marriage matters. That there is more element of choice. Right? So he says that regulation of marriage according to rules of caste is becoming less stringent. Again, the customs are changing. And he says that the customs are not changing at a very rapid pace, but they are changing nonetheless. So the insistence on endogamy is not as much as it used to be earlier. And the third point he says is, he points out, is in relation to occupation. तो ये तीन डोमेन्स हैं जिनके कॉन्टेक्स्ट में आंद्रे बेते हमसे ये बताते हैं कि कास्ट के अंदर काफ़ी बदलाव पिछले 30-40 साल में ऑब्जर्व किया जा रहा है. ऑक्यूपेशन के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में ही सेज दैट थिंग्स आर मोर फ्लेक्सिबल एंड नॉट दैट रिजिड. Education and professional occupation have brought about significance. So for example, thanks to reservation, thanks to all kinds of other interventions, if members from historically socially marginalized communities are entering into higher education institutions, then in all likelihood they are also entering into other walks of life. So untouchables are thankfully to be found in other domains. But again, उसको लेकर के भी मतलब एक काउंटर आर्ग्यूमेंट ये है कि अगर रिजर्वेशन नहीं हो तो शायद ये नहीं होगा. If society is left on its own, I don't think untouchables can ever make it to anywhere else because the society still remains casteist. But as I said, Andre Bete hain, senior sociologist hain, so we will simply go ahead with whatever he is saying. So he uses this term called caste-free occupations. He says that there is this emergence of caste, and he is basically referring to private sector. So caste-free occupations. तो ये तीन डोमेन्स हैं जिनके रिलेशन में इन्होंने बताया कि कास्ट इज अंडरगोइंग चेंजेस. प्योरिटी एंड पोल्यूशन, ऑक्यूपेशन एंड मैरिज. Lastly, so there are three more developments that I just want to quickly draw your attention to, and then we call it a day. So there are three transitions. One is called from system to identity, caste के context में. No, this is Dipankar Gupta, but you don't have to really source it, but कह सकते हैं. This is Dipankar Gupta. From system to identity, from hierarchy to identity, और एक और है from system to association. अब ये तीन चीज़ें हैं जो आज की डेट में कास्ट को समझने में हमारी मदद करती हैं. सो सिस्टम टू आइडेंटिटी का मतलब ये है दैट वी हैव कम फ्रॉम कास्ट सिस्टम टू caste identity. What does that mean? Generally speaking, people speak about caste system. System का क्या मतलब है? System essentially implies that there are different castes that are situated in an interdependent relationship. That's a system, right? System is always, it comprises parts. You cannot think of a system without parts. So system is an assembly. So system, abhi tak people were talking about caste system. But Dipankar Gupta is pointing out that we are now entering into an age which is of caste identity. What does that mean? So for example, again, if I refer to, let's say, Jats, dominant caste, do Jats really operate in a caste system, or they operate as a powerful dominant caste identity? So that's the argument, that now different castes are emerging as singular, powerful, assertive blocks, and they do not make their case. जैसे पहले Brahmins, how would they present themselves? They would present themselves through the system's narrative. Ki, in the caste system, we are up the hierarchy, and therefore you better listen to us. But the Jats are not at all concerned about where the system places them, right? The Jats don't give a damn. The Pattidars, they don't really care, as it were. So this is what Dipankar Gupta is arguing, that system ke, gone are the days of system. We are looking at an age wherein caste identities, meaning singular, single, assertive, and very confident, powerful caste identity groups are emerging. So that's point number one. तो जितनी भी dominant castes हैं, इनको आप इस angle से समझ सकते हैं. That now they are singular identities. Jats, Pattidars, Yadavs, etc. उसी से जुड़ा हुआ है from hierarchy to identity. So caste hierarchy also does not matter anymore. Mobilization, no, these are two different things. So caste hierarchy does not matter anymore in terms of understanding caste dynamics. For example, if the Jats are not interested in who is where, then is there any hierarchy? So basically, hierarchy and system went together. तो अगर system ही नहीं है, या अगर castes are not identifying themselves in terms of their relationship with other castes. No, wait. Mobilization is a different thing. We'll come to mobilization is a different thing. Mobility is different. See, mobilization is लोगों को जोड़ना. Mobility is going from position 1 to position 2. So caste mobilization can happen here as well. But I hope you were referring to caste mobility. Yeah. So wait, let's attend to the mobility thing in a minute. Let's first get this hierarchy and identity. Hierarchy के बारे में हमने क्या कहा? It's a vertical arrangement of groups, which means that there is more than one group. Now, if you have these powerful caste groups that are least interested in ritual hierarchy, they are least interested in where the Brahmins place them, they are least interested in how ritually pure they are, then what it means is that hierarchy no more is an important reference to understand the dynamics of caste in contemporary India. That is the argument. Now, as identity becomes more important, hierarchy becomes less important, or shall we say, not even secondary. तो अब अगर आपको आज के दौर में, if you have to understand caste politics, caste dynamics in India, you cannot really work with the logic of caste hierarchy. That's Dipankar Gupta's argument. One can contest it. इस पे सवाल उठा सकते हैं, बट मुझे लगता नहीं है GS social issues में इस पे सवाल उठाने की कोई ज़रूरत है. Sociology paper 2 perspectives on caste, we do that. We rip him apart. But here we will be very considerate, right? We won't bother him. तो दूसरा argument, mobility का जो case है, mobility का case है, that's still a very system reference. Because if you don't have other castes, right, there won't be mobility. But we have to also understand mobility is never in among dominant caste. उनको तो कोई ज़रूरत ही नहीं है. अब एक नए तरीके का संस्कृताइजेशन है. Now there are castes that are imitating the habits, not habits, the customs and traditions of the dominant caste. So this is a new kind of Sanskritization, wherein people, because they are powerful, so I would rather be like the Patidar, or I would rather be like the Okaliga, or be like the Reddy or Kurmi and so on. So it's a new kind of Sanskritization, but again, that I don't think is really needed a discussion on that right now. तीसरी चीज, sorry, बताइए. Yeah. Yeah, so they don't, yeah, so they don't speak about their status in relation to other castes. They speak about themselves independently of anything. So singular, right? That's the development. और फिर आखिरी चीज जो हमें आज की पॉलिटिक्स में कई बार देखने को मिलती है, from system to association. So we now witness various caste associations. And in these, what happen is, there are different castes that come together to actually forge a certain political bloc in order to make strides in a certain electoral constituency. तो कास्ट सिस्टम हमें क्या बताता था? ये कास्ट अलग है, ये अलग है, ये अलग है. बट कास्ट एसोसिएशन इज अ न्यू थिंग, because what is happening is these different castes are putting aside the ritual differences, the scriptural differences, and they are essentially forging alliances because they have a political battle to fight. So these are, so secular interests will bring different castes together. So we are also seeing various caste associations. So long story short, in 21st century, if you have to speak about caste, you better not speak about caste system, because caste system does not really help us much in terms of understanding the contemporary reality of caste. So you speak about caste identity, you speak about caste, caste identity primarily, and you speak about caste associations. Right? So these are the three important developments, from system to identity, from hierarchy to identity, and from system to association. जी, आपको समझ में नहीं आया? ठीक, आप बताइए. नहीं. जाट कैसे अपने कास्ट सिस्टम से पावर डिराइव कर रहा है? अरे नहीं वो तो करेगा ही. But the point is, see, you have to see the parameters have changed. For example, the way in which the Brahmins are deriving their power. Are the Yadavs also deriving their power from the same source? No. बताइए. The Brahmins only have one narrative, which is the ritual narrative. The Yadavs don't give a damn about rituals, because if you go into the rituals domain, see, it's almost like if you play on their turf, you lose. So you change the turf. It's a chess game. If you play white and you go for a certain opening, I have no other option but to go for a certain response to that opening. तो ये तो जब तक आप white है आपके पास, तो आप तो game determine कर सकते हैं. But the dominant caste are very clear. They'll say, we will not play this game. We are not interested in what the scriptures are saying. Yeah. So see, there are few rituals that every caste has. What I am pointing out is that the Brahmin superiority is informed by simply ritual status. The Jat superiority is to do with land ownership, numerical strength, political clout, muscular power, all of that. And so it's a very different kind of dominance. And they are least, something that I'm constantly repeating, they are least interested in where they stand, because they don't have this idea of a system. They don't want to work with that logic. क्योंकि जैसे ही आप सिस्टम के लॉजिक में जाएंगे, कास्ट सिस्टम, then you are situated. The Brahmins are at the top, the untouchables are down the ladder, and you are somewhere in the middle. नहीं, आप किसी जाट से बात करिए, मुझे नहीं लगता, मार पिटाई हो जाएगी अगर वो अगर आपने कह दिया है कि तुम नीचे हो तो. They are very clear about it. There are very, see, I'll just tell you because this can just go on. There's an excellent ethnography where Dipankar Gupta spoke to a Jat farmer. And Dipankar Gupta said कि भाई Brahmins तो ऊपर होते हैं. So the Jat said that look at these muscles. I can crush two Brahmins with one muscle of mine. This is what he said. And it's written in the book Rivalry and Brotherhood. So basically it's very clear कि ritual कुछ भी होगा. End of the day, I can crush the bones of a Brahmin. Now that's a very different logic of dominance. You can't really contest that. Now, and why is that logic? We have to also understand the logic that assertion is to do with numbers. Right? So all these dominant caste people know that they have numbers on their side. The Brahmins never speak for their dominance in terms of numbers. A Brahmin might be the only person in the court, the Mughal court or in the ancient Indian court, but he will speak for his dominance because he is a Brahmin and he does not want 10,000 Brahmins around. The only person can simply say, all of you are below my feet. And he knows that nobody is going to contest it. ऐसा नहीं कि सब लोग मिलके उसको lynch कर देंगे वहाँ पे. No, because everyone believes that yes, we are actually your servants. But the Jats work with, or the Marathas and the Pattidars, it's about numbers. A Brahmin is a systemic reference. And Yadav, Pattidar, and so on, these are all identity, caste identity references. कौन सी mobility? किस में? No, there is mobility. See, but the mobility is different. For example, a lot of Jats have become very prosperous. There is economic mobility. They kept owning more and more land. And as a result of that, the second generation, third generation beneficiary of Green Revolution are in the US, in Canada, in various parts of Europe. So there is mobility, but ये mobility अलग है. Sanskritization वाली mobility दूसरी है. वो तो within the system है. एक mobility वो है जो transnational है. कि मैं ग्रीन रेवोल्यूशन से मुझे बहुत फ़ायदा हुआ, मैंने अपने बच्चे को आईआईटी में या कहीं पे भी पढ़ा के एंड देन आई हैव सेंट हिम टू कनाडा. तो ये दूसरी मोबिलिटी हो गई. एंड देन द नेक्स्ट जनरेशन नेवर विजिटेड इंडिया. दिस इज अनदर काइंड ऑफ मोबिलिटी. सो मोबिलिटी है, बट द नेचर ऑफ मोबिलिटी चेंजेस फ्रॉम वन केस टू अनदर. लॉन्ग अगेन द शॉर्ट, यू हैव अ क्वेश्चन, बताइए. They wanted reservation, yes, but there is, so uske liye ek alag discussion hai. So why is it that the OBCs want reservation, and what is wrong with the OBC demand for reservation in government jobs? It's a completely different discussion, but that's not really related to this, but it's an important discussion, and we will take it up when we come towards the end of it, where we look at some of the contemporary concerns, caste census, OBC demand for further reservation, etc. But abhi ke liye just system to identity, hierarchy to identity, and system to association. I think that will be all for today. Thank you.